I am David Wertheim, Director of the Manasseh Ben Israel Institute for Jewish Studies, an academic partnership between the Universiteit van Amsterdam and the Jewish Cultural Quarter. And I would like to welcome you to this event in the art project on Friendship Collateral Damage 3, the third GaLUT, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Amsterdam, on behalf of all the participating institutes, which are the Duitsland Institute, SPUI25 and the Metropole International Art Project. This project and to this event with our distinguished speaker Ella Shohat, who is professor at the Department of Arts and Public Policy, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. She has written on issues extensively on issues having to do with diasporic, post-colonial and transnational approaches to cultural studies. Since the 1980s, more specifically, her writing has focused on Middle Eastern Jews, shaping critical conceptual frameworks for the study of the idea of the Arab Jew. She is an important voice and exponent of the, I think, very important trend in academic scholarship to try not to look at the world from a Western or European perspective. She published an impressive amount of books and articles. Let me just name a few important ones. The collections on the Arab Jew, Palestine and other displacements, selected writings from 2017, and from 2006 also a collection of essays, Taboo Memories, Diasporic Voices. She also wrote a very interesting cultural work on Israeli cinema, East-West and the politics of representation. So I'd like to ask you to come to the floor and to deliver your lecture called Remainders Revisited, an Exilic Journey from Hakham Sasson Khdhuri to Joseph Sassoon Semah.
Hello everyone. Yeah, I'd like to be taller, but too late for that. Thank you all for coming. It's truly, truly a pleasure. Thank you, David, for the generous introduction. Thank you, Linda, for the curating this event, and thank you, Joseph, for an incredible project. While I should reveal to you, my plan was, for a long time, was to do research and write about Hakham Sasson Khdhuri, whom, of course, every Iraqi Jew especially has heard and known, because he has been part of the community lives for many decades as the leader of the community, the president, and the leading Hakham, which is our way of the word would be translated into rabbi. But Joseph actually, in his incredible project, gave me a lovely opportunity to connect what I always like connecting, which is past and present. I'm not a historian, I should start with that. So my interest in history comes as a cultural studies scholar who is interested in looking at the present in light of reading of the past, but also looking at the continuities. There is often, when we think about the notion of home and exile, especially post-48, we think of all Jews in relation to Israel, especially if we come or born or raised in Israel, which is also the case of definitely the work of Joseph. But there is another story to his family, as to most Iraqi Jewish stories. And that's what happened before and what happened after 48, and what is the relationship to the culture that was produced for millennia in the space called Mesopotamia. Does the departure, the mass departure that happened post-48 suggest that this whole thing was forgotten and we are simply transformed into being Israelis or Jews wherever we are, in this case Dutch Jews or American Jews, etc.? What is the place of that memory in the ongoing cultural production of the descendants, even younger people, people who do not anymore speak Arabic, which was the primary language in Iraq for Jews, in our specific dialect, in the case of Iraq, the Judeo-Baghdadi dialect, which is generally called, by the way, Moslawi dialect in the context of Iraq, the northern Iraqi dialect? Or is it simply a matter of we simply erase that, forget that, and or simply it's in a safe box called the past, called history? What I think is incredibly important in the project that Joseph started here, Joseph Semah, not the biblical Joseph, because I will come to that too. What I think is incredible in the story of, in the project, is that actually we have connecting past and present. That the space of exile is the space of coming into, in this case, Amsterdam, is a place to reflect about this very convoluted and complex history. And I will come back to that historical background. This is a photo, which is a family photo that Joseph gave me, where you see baby Joseph, 2 years old. Is it 2 years old?
1 year? Maybe.
1 year, probably. We should say around, probably around 49, with his parents holding him, and Hakham Sasson Khdhuri, the leader of the community, on the very right of the photo. So I thought this would be a nice photo to start our conversation about the more literal links between Iraq, between Baghdad and Amsterdam. Remember, the title of this project is the title is the third GaLUT, the third exile, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Amsterdam. And so we begin here with a very almost literal connection. But the more complicated historical elements have to do with how do we read the notion of place, makom in Hebrew, makam in Arabic, and the relationship between not simply the grandson and the grandfather, but rather the place of the grandfather in history, and how the children and the grandchildren's generation, who have been, for the most part, displaced now completely from Iraq, can think about their own history, their biography, and understanding of the crisis, the trauma, the emotional upheaval, the identity crisis that has been generated in the wake of that traumatic dislocation from Iraq. One of the ways in which the official ideology, and you will hear in my talk that I, as an intellectual or as a scholar, reading about the history of ethno-nationalism in general, it is not a formation that I feel comfortable with. But there is some kind of an anomalous elements in the context of the Jewish nationalist project, because it builds on a certain kind of a biblical idea of the notion of the ingathering of the exiles. The ingathering of the exile and the restoration of the diaspora and the coming to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Now, the problem is that, for us, is the key question here, how this ethno-nationalist project was translated, how a religious idea of ingathering of the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon was translated in the late 19th century into an ethno-nationalist project in which it was no longer a messianic idea, say utopianist or not utopianist, but in any case, a messianic idea, but rather one that suggested that all Jews, by definition, their origins is from the land of Israel, and that therefore would, that the ingathering of exile would mean now as a literal return of all those Jews. The story of the Hakham Sasson Semah, is very much caught in that conflict, to my mind, between a certain kind of a traditional Judaic interpretation of the messianic notion of return and the new, modern, late 19th century notion of ethno-nationalist conception of restoration, which is also connected to a certain kind of a Protestant ideas, especially, for example, in England, about the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. So while the Jewish question has emerged in Europe, especially with the 19th century notion of the place of the Jews, and especially with the Enlightenment and the division, the notion of citizenship, which would mean that Jews, say in France, could be citizen if they let go of religion in the public sphere and that become part of the private sphere, and therefore the notion of a Jew at home but not in the public sphere. That Jewish question traveled, as it were, to the places that were gradually coming under the influence or direct colonization in North Africa and in the Middle East by European powers, largely France and Britain. And that has tremendous impact, especially after World War I, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the generation of the Balfour Declaration about a Jewish homeland. Now the question is how to regard the opposition of Jewish leaders, not only in the Arab world, but throughout Europe, to that project. The story of Hakham Sasson Khdhuri is very much connected to that reaction to a project that one can say either on messianic or religious tradition seemed foreign, or both seemed to introduce new paradigms to the region that were about to spell out trouble, as they did. So the question is, and I'm not here to answer that question, is the notion of Jewish nationalism a rescue narrative of oppressed Jews as minorities in the Arab world, I'm not talking about Europe, in Muslim spaces, or was it an answer to a problem that emerged in European context and actually generated a problem where there was no need for that type of a solution? But that solution was introduced into the region. So that's a huge historical question, an uncomfortable one. I can certainly attest to that. However, it is a crucial question for us to begin to understand why a president of the Jewish community would be now part of that storm that was emerging, especially with the younger Jews in Iraq, because the majority of Jews, the Jewish community, were not involved either in Iraqi nationalism or in Zionism or in communism. And that was very much some of the younger generation were involved in this major ideological dilemmas post, British colonization of the region, and especially with the emergence of the Iraqi nationalism that was gradually coming to be posited as part of pan-Arab or Arab nationalism, where the question of Palestine began to be important. And whether or not the Jews as individual Jewish Iraqi Jews took a position on that question, they came to be interpolated in that question and gradually came to be identified, and in general, unfortunately I should say, Arab nationalist discourse came to equate Judaism with nationalism, and therefore generating an uncomfortable, to say the least, conceptually, a place for indigenous Jews, but more importantly, with that struggle and conflict and war zone in the Middle East, the place of, in this case, Iraqi Jews, was becoming impossible. So this is just to give you a sense of the background. It culminated, of course, in the post-48 era with the with this partition of Palestine, 47, the UN Declaration on the Partition of Palestine, 48, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the war that was taking place where, unfortunately, the Iraqi regime was involved in subjecting the community to incredible pressures and harassment, and generating under international pressure what came to be known as the displaced, or where Jews were given 1 year. This is still the Hakham in the 20s, just to give you, a brief history, with the king of Iraq, and here with, again, the king. This is in 1950. But just to give you a sense that in this period of the Tasqit, where Jews were given the possibility of living Iraq, departing to Israel under the auspices of the British, and ending up with the majority of the community being dislocated, whether they wanted actually to leave or not. And one of the key questions that I raised in the introduction to this, in my work on this question, when there is this issue, are the Jews from Iraq refugees, or are they olim, to use the official Israeli lingo, people who chose to come to the birthplace of the Jews? Sometimes you would see both terms being used. I would argue that in contrast to the Palestinians, where the notion of dislocation and the fact that Palestinians did not want to leave and want to return, the case of Arab Jews in general, Middle Eastern Jews, is more complicated. And the idiosyncrasies of the situation of a community trapped between two nationalisms, Arab and Jewish, have generated a proliferation of terms to designate the dislocation. You would hear many terms in Hebrew, Yetziah, or Aliyah, which is ascendancy, Yetziah, exit, exodus, expulsion, immigration, emigration, exile, population exchange, where the Jews of Iraq exchange with the Palestinians. None of the terms, I would say, in my longer work, not here, I try to suggest that none of the terms actually is fully adequate to describe the complexity of the situation. Because the question of will, desire, and agency remain much more ambivalent and ambiguous in the case of Iraqi Jews, whether they actually wanted to leave, did they have any choice in the matter, did they have power over their destiny, and once they were dislocated, did they want to return, and could they actually return? So we can elaborate more later if you want to ask me more questions about this. So this is sort of like the backdrop against which we have to think of the role of the Hakham trying to negotiate and shepherding and leading a community under not only national, regional, but international circumstances that in fact continued after he stayed, because while the majority of the family left, he remained, and also with his son Shaul, who wrote a memoir. This is the Tasqit, this is the Synagogue of Meir Tweg, which Joseph Sasson has a model, and we will discuss it, an architectural model based on this. This is the moment of registration to depart from Iraq, the 1 year that Jews were given permission to depart without any possibility of return. But the Hakham stayed, and there are different estimation of numbers, about 15,000, 20,000 Jews remained in Iraq for different reasons, whether they did not want to leave their lives, or because they felt that once the storm is over, things will be better. And some actually believed and saw themselves as Iraqis for most, and did not want to, they identified with Iraq. And this is, in the early 60s, a ceremony of graduation from Franrini School, where the Hakham was, who participated not simply in rabbinical or Judaic life, Judaic decisions, but also in generally the social life of the community. So this was a graduation ceremony. This is a wedding event of his grandson, Zuhair, the son of Shaul, who wrote the autobiography. This is the symbol of the signature, the stamp. And here is one of his declaration that the Jews, this is from the 30s actually, where he asked not to equate Judaism with Zionism. And here is the biography is written by his son, a leader in his community, which was actually published after the son left, and it was written in 1999 and published in Jerusalem by an academic press of the Iraqi Jews in Jerusalem, who actually, the leader of this academic press, of course, believed in the nationalist project, and they saw the persecution, especially that was taking place after '67 with the Ba'athist Party of Jews, as a sign that those who stayed in Iraq made the wrong decision. And that's still a subject for a historical debate. So in any event, so to explain the third GaLUT here of the overall project of Joseph Sasson Semah is really to ask historical questions on the one hand. What is a third GaLUT? Of course, we begin with the Bible, with the biblical narrative about Babylonia as being the space of the paradigmatic, shall we say, Judaic GaLUT of the Jews who had to leave forced to leave Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and end up by the water of Babylon. There we lay down and wept when we remembered Isaiah, of course. So with that notion, one departure from Jerusalem raises, of course, question about Babylonia being an exilic space. But we come back to the modern history, and then we say, for those who left Iraq, who also felt exiled, even for those who had, for one reason or another, who left Iraq and continued to miss its culture, and especially in the West and in the Israeli context, where they were very much deprived for many decades of any association with Arabic culture, because now the Arab was the enemy in the context of Israel, just as the Jew was the enemy in the context of Iraq. So trapped between those two hostile spaces, Arabic culture in Israel, which was the culture of the majority of Jews from Arab countries in Israel, was not really a legitimate legitimate part of the public sphere. Therefore, that sense of alienation very much generated another mode of exile within Israel. So on one level, one could say, after all, Israel was kind of a utopianist notion of restoration of the Jews to the Promised Land. On another level, one can say, no, the ethno-nationalist paradigm in its very Eurocentric formulation did not really welcome Jews, Arab Jews, Jews from Muslim spaces with their own cultural specificity, and in many ways have led to that sense of alienation and estrangement in the place that they should have felt being at home. So, however, and we're coming back to the third notion of exile, and that in the case of Joseph Semah being Amsterdam, the place where he sought refuge from that, shall I say, that's my reading or interpretation of the sense, and you're welcome to argue with me, Joseph, later, a sense of alienation from the very place to which he arrived as a baby, but did not really feel, I should say, in general, of our generation, not exactly feeling at home, and then you can say resulting, at least in our parallel cases, a certain mode of self-exiling, where the new places, in his case Amsterdam, shall I say my place, New Amsterdam, in New York, feeling both at home and in exile. And in fact, throughout the work, my overall argument, it would be that throughout his work, notion of home and exile are very much intertwined and hardly separate. Exile can become home as well. And that exile is not simply about a geography, it is also about how we imagine and think about the world as a kind of almost an epistemological intervention, in the sense of always having a sense of distance in relation to our environment, to think about it critically. So this section in my work about Joseph Semah is entitled Alphabet as Exilic Iconography. What you can see in this work is a juxtaposition of three national birds. The national bird on the left of Holland, the Netherlands, sorry, of Joseph, the Israeli national bird, Joseph, and then of Iraq, Yusuf. And each one has different script and different letters. So from the right now, Iraq's national bird, the chukar partridge, okay, in the middle, the hupi, the Israel's national bird, and then you have on the left, you have the black-tailed godwit, the Dutch. I was not into national birds, but what I realized is that by doing some research about the birds, it's actually perfect to have those drawings and then have them wrapped, as it were, with different scripts. Because all of those different scripts actually reveal a trajectory, an exilic trajectory from an Arabic-speaking universe into, on the right side, because we can read it from, you can look at it from left to right, or you can look at it from right to left. An exilic journey from Arabic through Hebrew, and then to the Latin script. Now, of course, it depends how you look at this photo, and I think if you are a native reader from left to right, but if you were to read it from right to left, not knowing the Hebrew or the Arabic script, then that would generate a certain kind of a sense of alienation for the viewer looking at this image. And I think that sense of alienation generates for the viewer of the artist a certain kind of parallel emotional space, or at least a kind of a distance, that when the artwork deals with exile, it's almost a kind of an emotional space that parallels the very artwork that deals with a sense of belonging and unbelonging simultaneously. But also because national symbols are part of a kind of a very artificial idea. After all, birds do not belong to a nation. We do not want to, this notion of, and if anything, birds fly across borders and have become symbols precisely of transcending the boundaries of borders and national geography. The birds themselves exist in the region and throughout diverse regions, and therefore call attention to a very, from the 80s especially, a critique of the idea of nationalism and seeing how nationalism are very much invented. So I thought it was just perfect because all of those symbols, like a flag, etc., are ultimately representation, they're symbols. And in many ways, those birds become a representation of a representation. Now, let me move on just to the notion of, there is also another dimension to the Joseph story, and that's, of course, the biblical idea. And this is another work, which is called 56 Eggs, 36 Candle Holders. And it is, the name here, too, is embroidered in 3 different scripts, but this time in a kind of a gender reversal, on 3 female white nightgowns. But here it's the Joseph story, the iconic ornate robe from the Bible, Ketonet Apasim, that concerns the motifs of displacement, betrayal, and scapegoating, but also forgiveness and resumed brotherly love. Born to the patriarchal Jacob and the patriarch Jacob and the matriarch Rachel in Haran, in northern Mesopotamia, which is now actually located in Turkey, the family journeyed back to Canaan, settling in Hebron. But the more familiar dislocation narrative, as we know, concerns the moving from Canaan to Egypt as a result of the betrayal of innocent Joseph by his brothers, who stripped him of his ornate robe and threw him into the cistern. They dipped Joseph's robe in the blood of a goat they slaughtered, only to tell their father that a ferocious animal had devoured his son, when in fact they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Joseph forgives his brother, an act that dresses him with the adjective Hatzadik, the righteous one, within the Jewish tradition, highlighted in Semah's allusion to the Lamed Tav Tzadikim, or 36 righteous people. A kind of foundational scapegoat story, Joseph ends up in a foreign land enduring false accusation and imprisonment. Now, he becomes the ultimate, this kind of multilingual entrance or multilingual into the biblical narrative, and the multilingual utterance of the same name, Joseph Yosef, must also be considered in relation to the thematization of the scapegoat in his 1986 work, Sa'ir LaAzazel, or the Azazel goat, the scapegoat. And in many ways, I want to relate it and think about it, that the traditional animal sacrifice as a form of atonement, on one level, the scapegoat parable is about betrayal and exile, right? Moving from Canaan to Egypt. But I also suggest that there is emergence of another allegory for a contemporary epic scale cross-border movement between enemy zones. In the wake of their exodus from Iraq and their shock of arrival in Israel, Iraqi Jews often gave expression to their sense of betrayal by both Iraq and Israel. Referring to the rumors about the secretive deal between Iraqi and Israeli government under the auspices of the British, they pointed out to the Iraqi regimes benefiting financially from the property left behind, and to Israel from turning them into cheap labor. And the phrase was, ba'ona, they sold us. And that gave expression to an embittered sense of no exit situation, from a pre-departure fear of persecution if they were to remain in Iraq, to post-arrival encounter with Euro-Israel racist attitudes and discourses. So this is really the core of that sense of betrayal and the notion of the feeling of scapegoat that I would read that work allegorically. Now, in many ways also, it's the question about how one narrates the so-called Jewish diaspora as an endless sense of persecution, and in many ways the story of Exodus and the departure from Egypt places emphasis on the persecution by the Pharaoh. But one could also emphasize the entrance into Egypt, I would suggest, which was escape from famine, and later, at least, a certain kind of welcoming, right? Where the Ramses gives the region as part of the land of Egypt open for Joseph and his family. So even that sense of what is home and not home in the biblical narrative is much more complicated. The very same thing about Mesopotamia. Is Babylon only a place of exile? But after all, as I mentioned before, the family of Jacob end up in Haran, which is Mesopotamia. And before that, the foundational narrative about Abraham as the iconoclastic figure emerges in the context of Mesopotamia, or Kasdim, or of the Kildanis, the Chaldeans. So Abraham, the progenitor, is also from Mesopotamia, and that raises question about the place of birth in the Bible of Abraham as opposed to the promised land as the place of telos. What is home? So my point is that even when we take the biblical motifs which are evoked through the work of Joseph Semah, we actually find complexity in terms of exile and home once one reads the narrative themselves, between the biological place of birth into the place of destination, divine destination, as opposed to the place of departure, but also a place where ultimately, for millennia, Jews lived and created. Of course, one of the well-known texts to have been produced is the Babylonian Talmud, which is also part of Joseph Semah's earlier work. How much time do we have?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, thank you. So this idea of third GaLUT gets to be very complicated, as this is the Sa'ir L'Azazel, the scapegoat, when we think about the places of departure, where Jews ultimately generated. I will come back to that image in a moment, but I want to go here to the fact that the notion of exile, and here is, I just want to show this image here of, we'll come back, but this is, yeah. This is the Ezekiel tomb in Iraq. Okay, here is today. Film. This is from the 30s. Jewish prayer in the Ezekiel tomb in Iraq. So the question, even though as a prophet of exile, it was also very much part of the culture of Iraqi Jews, especially during what is called Shavuot or Eid Ziyara, where they would go to pray, and it was part of a trip, an annual trip to that tomb. So even within the biblical prophets themselves, the question of exile comes to be part of forming a home. Let's not forget that even when King Cyrus, king of Persia, offered the exiled Jews the possibility of return to Jerusalem, many did not return. So that actually also suggests that the notion of attachment to a place comes to be much more complicated than simply suggesting a separation from the place, the idea of Zion and Babylon in itself become a complicated narrative. Now, I think what's interesting that it's ultimately the third place, Amsterdam, is where all of this work is happening. The reflection about the dislocation from Iraq, the dislocation from Israel, is that Amsterdam becomes, in the words of Joseph Semah, my city of refuge. And of course it was very hard. When I was reading these words, I was actually thinking, well, it's very hard not to think of Amsterdam's own history. And of course David wrote a lot about it, is the space of the Amsterdam becoming already a place of refuge, going back to the Sephardic Jews back to 1492, but more importantly to the dislocation of largely the Portuguese, with the Portuguese Inquisition in 1536. And that, with the end of Al-Andalus as the place of convivencia of Jews, Muslim, and Christian, the fall of Granada in 1492, and that's when Amsterdam also becomes a place of refuge, and therefore you have, of course, the Beta Haim cemetery in Amstel, dating back to 1614, and the Portuguese synagogue dating back to 1674, and the intellectual impact of figure like Menashe ben Israel, that you had the Institute for Jewish and Social Cultural Studies, which is named after him, and of course the figure of Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher, who and that I think we want to hear. Sorry, we have to go back. Here it is. You know that statue much better than I do, although I took many photos of his statue. I was kind of intrigued with the work that. Let me just here, basically, to think about Spinoza's own work as a pantheist thinker, and that the notion of the third GaLUT, this statue by Nicholas Dings from 2008, in front of the City Hall, which was, I guess, the entrance to the old Jewish quarter where Spinoza grew up. And that takes us back to Joseph Semah's notion of birds, whereas in this statue, it evokes, of course, Spinoza pantheist philosophy. And the work, actually, of Nicholas Dings comments that the birds, the two birds chosen for the statue, are sparrows, which is the archetypical bird which no longer ubiquitous in Amsterdam, and the rose-ringed parakeets, the once an exotic bird, so-called exotic bird that adapted to the local climate. So that takes us back to Semah's iconography of birds as allegorizing cross-border movement. But while the birds dotting Spinoza clock translate, as it were, his philosophical pantheism into visual language, in the third GaLUT of Joseph Semah's work, the birds, as a representation of a representation, come to signify the interstitial space between home and exile. So now I want to move to the last section called Remainders Remain, and remind you that I cannot go right now into, we don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this work, but this work, which is basically is based on, it's based on wildlife of Iraq, the skulls, the sketching of drawing of skulls, which are shrouded with threads based on Jewish law civic architecture from Baghdad. That actually, rather than evoking the biblical narrative, that refers to the modernism and the cultural and civilizational syncretism that has been taking place, in this case, in Iraq, where all traditional architecture was now being mixed with Art Deco buildings, with stations, the train stations, cinemas, movie theaters, etc. So it's interesting that the threads represent, in a kind of abstract fashion, the various buildings, but they're superimposed on the remainders, which are also part of the indigeneity of the region. So you have here a kind of visual palimpsest that is very much part of the syncretism of Baghdad, which is much more directly articulated, really, in the architectural models that Joseph has built. Here is one that is based on a train station built in the 30s, and another one here based on the Tigris Palace Hotel, which is, by the way, also mentioned in Agatha Christie's novel. So, you know, if you took the Orient Express, remember the Berlin-Baghdad railway, which also the Orient Express arrived, and, you know, you have this kind of Art Deco buildings throughout the region. Okay. So what I thought was interesting in this kind of work is that we have references to the various aspects of the, here. And here we go into the synagogue model. This is the model of one of the more recent synagogue built in Baghdad in 1942. The Meir Tweg synagogue, which is the last functioning synagogue in Iraq. This is the model built on that. But what's interesting about it is that it is a synagogue that was, here, this is today, is that actually its architecture was part of the new neighborhood that was built, the modern neighborhood in Baghdad called Batawin, which was an affluent neighborhood and mixed neighborhood of Muslim, Christians, and Jews to live together. And their houses reflected an architecture of, the streets were wider, and the architecture itself reflected not the horsh, which is the interior garden, but rather the external front yard, as with modern or Western, at the time, what was seen as Western modern architecture, although they kept the flat roofs, as was common in the region, rather than the roof that were more common in the Mediterranean, although the internal part, you can see, evokes that. But it also evokes something else, which has to do with the cemeteries, the traditional cemeteries in Baghdad. If you could see, this is the tombstone that was very common. This is from the Jewish cemetery in Baghdad. And you can see that the internal part of the model evokes also visually. And I thought it was very intriguing that it is evokes the notion of the title of this artwork of the model based on the synagogue of Meir Tweg. It's actually, the title is Between Graveyard and Museum Sphere. That's in itself extremely intriguing, and to my mind, the whole notion of graveyard and museum to me ultimately are deeply related, especially when we think about I would call it I would think about it as the museumification of our history, where it is the end of an era and the end of a community that no longer exists in Iraq and can only be located within museums, or one can call it the entombization of to being in tomb-like circumstances, where it is, I call it actually the last of the Mohican syndrome elsewhere, where we are simply associated with words of lost, last, and vanishing, the disappearance, and then therefore we can only be found. And this is sort of like the cloth of the robe of and the clothing of Hakham Sasson Khdhuri, and is donated to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And it has become part of this museum folkloric history of Arab Jews, now seen as only belonging to the past, as though it has nothing to do with the ongoing younger generation, as simply an end without continuity. And it's presented as part of a general, the idea of exotic kind of ethnology of the disappearing Jews. Which is why the notion of tomb and museum now could make complete sense, coming together to suggest a burial of a past, not simply of a body, but a body of a community. However, the continuation of the work and the remembrance and remembrance of the work is fascinating. This is today the Meir Tweg Synagogue continuing, is in the work of reviving and remembering, as Joseph Semah does. Here is the model for the tomb of Ezekiel, but here now being placed here in Amsterdam in a mosque. And I thought this was, with this work, I would like to end our presentation, because what I found intriguing here in this work is that it is now a new kind of dialogue that appears, especially in the era where the Jew and the Muslim are supposed to be in, presumably the perennial enemies. What it does evoke is actually, we thought about Al-Andalus, right? It was the Inquisition and the escape of Portuguese Jews, say, to Amsterdam. There is a return, as it were, to another kind of a convivencia, as a model, as a hope, as a promise. And to place, let's also remember that Ezekiel is also a prophet within Islamic tradition, not just in Jewish tradition. And his holy site was also a place of pilgrimage, as were all in other Arab countries, for Muslims as well, not only, and shared between Muslims and Jews. So there is a kind of closing of a circle by placing in Amsterdam. Now Amsterdam become that place, the makom, or makan, that could now accommodate the Jew and the Muslim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture.